All right, ready to dive into this one. Ambiguity, huh? It's funny, because even the word ambiguous can be, well, ambiguous.
Yeah.
I mean, it can mean something is kind of doubtful or uncertain, or it can mean a sign has like multiple meanings.
Right.
And for you as a philosopher, I mean, dealing with language all the time, that kind of slipperiness,
Yeah.
it must be both fascinating and a bit of a headache, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a constant challenge, that's for sure.
So today we're going to tackle this whole idea of ambiguity head on. We're drawing mainly from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on it.
Great source.
Yeah, it's really comprehensive. And our mission here is to really unpack what ambiguity is, at least when it comes to language.
Okay.
And maybe even more importantly, what it isn't.
Right.
We'll dig into why this has been such a thorny issue for philosophers, the kinds of problems it creates. But also, we'll look at those times when a bit of ambiguity can actually be a good thing.
That's an interesting angle.
Yeah, because language, it's not always about being perfectly clear and precise, is it?
Not at all. Sometimes a little bit of wiggle room, a bit of openness to interpretation can be quite powerful.
Exactly. So, to kick things off, the Stanford entry starts by defining ambiguity. And it's pretty straightforward at first glance.
How so?
Well, they say it's basically a property of signs like words, phrases, sentences, the things we use to communicate.
Right.
And what makes them ambiguous is that they can have multiple legitimate interpretations.
Within a given language system, of course.
Of course. But then it gets a bit messy because it seems like in everyday conversations, we use the word ambiguity pretty loosely.
Oh, for sure, all the time.
Like the entry points out how we might talk about a politician being strategically ambiguous, meaning they're being intentionally vague.
Right.
Or we might say Jane's sister will visit
Yeah.
is ambiguous if Jane happens to have like a dozen sisters.
Yeah, that's not true ambiguity, though.
Exactly. And then there's all this talk about ambiguous movie endings or medical diagnoses being ambiguous.
It's important to make that distinction, I think, especially for someone interested in the philosophy of language.
So you're saying those everyday uses, they're not really what linguistic ambiguity is all about.
Well, not in the strict sense. Like with the Jane's sister example, it's more a case of underspecificity. We just don't know which sister is coming.
Okay, so it's not that the phrase itself has multiple meanings, it's just that it leaves some information out.
Right. And linguistic theorists make a big deal about that distinction.
That makes sense. So for a philosopher like you, why all the fuss about ambiguity? Why does it matter so much?
Oh, there are a few reasons, actually. It's not just about being nitpicky with definitions.
Good, because I was starting to worry.
For one thing, ambiguity highlights the big difference between formal languages, like the kind we use in logic, and natural languages, the way we actually speak and write.
Right, those formal languages are super strict and precise, right?
Yeah, every symbol has a very specific meaning, but with natural language, it's all so much messier and more fluid.
So trying to represent a natural language argument in a formal system, that must be a nightmare for someone like you, right?
It can be, especially when you're dealing with terms that have multiple interpretations lurking beneath the surface.
Oh, like that classic example they give. All bachelors are necessarily unmarried, and Adam was a bachelor, which then supposedly leads to the conclusion that Adam is necessarily unmarried.
Exactly. It seems valid at first glance, but it hinges on the ambiguous meaning of bachelor.
Right. Because in one sense, bachelor just means an unmarried man.
But in another sense, it could refer to someone who has a bachelor's degree.
And of course, Adam, being the first man, didn't exactly go to college.
So the argument falls apart because the meaning of bachelor shifts. It's a classic example of equivocation, which can totally undermine an argument's validity.
That's sneaky. So for philosophers, ambiguity is like a logic trap you've got to watch out for.
Absolutely. And it's not just in arguments. Frege, for example, was so concerned with ambiguity that he actually envisioned a perfect language, one that would be completely free of it.
Wow, a language with zero ambiguity. I can't even imagine.
Right. But he saw the potential for multiple interpretations as a real defect of natural language.
But then, the entry also talks about how artists and writers actually embrace ambiguity.
Oh, yeah, they love it. It's one of their tools.
That seems like a complete 180 from what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
So how does that work? Why would they want to be ambiguous?
Well, in art, ambiguity can be a really powerful way to enrich a work. It can create layers of meaning, spark curiosity, and make the audience think harder.
So it's about making the audience work for it a little bit.
In a way, yeah. Like, think about Pynchon's novel Against the Day. He uses the pronoun them in a way that its reference is constantly shifting.
Intriguing.
And that adds a whole layer of complexity and intrigue to the story.
Okay, I get that. Or there's that line in Romeo and Juliet where Romeo talks about being a grave man.
Right, the double meaning of grave is brilliant there.
Yeah.
It adds this poignant layer to his defiance.
And then there's humor, like Groucho Marx's famous line, I shot an elephant in my pajamas.
Classic. The ambiguity there is what makes it funny.
Yeah, you instantly picture this absurd image because you don't know if he means he was wearing pajamas when he shot the elephant or if the elephant was somehow wearing his pajamas.
And that's all thanks to syntactic ambiguity. The sentence structure allows for those two different readings.
So ambiguity can be a source of humor too.
Absolutely. And it's not just logic and art where ambiguity matters. The entry also points out how it plays a role in law.
Oh, right. Laws have to be clear and unambiguous, don't they?
Ideally, yes. But in reality, there's often a lot of ambiguity in legal language, which can have real-world consequences. It can affect how laws are applied and even whether people can understand them well enough to obey them.
That's a bit unsettling, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be. There's a really interesting case they mention, Smith versus United States, where the question was whether using a firearm as barter for drugs counted as using a firearm in the commission of a crime.
Wow, that's a tricky one.
And it all came down to how the court interpreted the phrase using a firearm. So you see, something as seemingly abstract as linguistic ambiguity can have real-world legal ramifications.
Yeah, that's a good point. And finally, the entry mentions that studying how we resolve ambiguity, how we figure out what something means when it could mean multiple things, that actually gives us insight into our own cognitive processes.
Exactly. How do we, as language users, navigate all these potential meanings and arrive at a single interpretation, at least most of the time?
Right, most of the time.
That process of ambiguity resolution, it's really key to understanding how we think and how we make sense of the world through language.
So it's not just about words on a page, it's about what's happening in our minds.
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like philosophers have been grappling with ambiguity for centuries.
Oh, yeah, it's a long-standing issue. The entry takes us all the way back to Aristotle for this one.
Aristotle, wow.
Yeah, in his work Sophistical Refutations, he was already talking about fallacies that come from ambiguity.
Oh, right, those arguments that seem valid but aren't.
And he also talked about something called amphiboly, which is a kind of structural ambiguity where the grammar of a sentence allows for multiple interpretations.
So even back then, philosophers were aware of how language could trick us, how it could lead to misunderstandings.
Absolutely. And the Stoics were also fascinated by ambiguity. Chrysippus, one of the leading Stoic philosophers, actually suggested that every word is ambiguous.
Every word? Really?
Well, he meant it in the sense that even a single person might understand the same word in different ways at different times.
Oh, I see. So it's not just that different people might interpret words differently, but even our own understanding can shift.
Exactly. And then later on, as philosophers started delving deeper into the relationship between language and thought, a new question emerged. Could our internal language of thought, the way we think to ourselves, could that be ambiguous too?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, and Occam, the medieval philosopher, he had an interesting take on this. He thought that mental sentences could be ambiguous. Mental sentences?
Yeah, like the way we combine concepts in our minds. He thought those could have different structures, which would lead to ambiguity.
Okay.
But he didn't think the individual mental terms themselves, the basic concepts, were ambiguous.
So a mental sentence can be ambiguous because of the way the concepts are put together, but the concepts themselves are stable.
So that's basically the gist of it. And then we have Frege again, who, as we mentioned, was really obsessed with eliminating ambiguity.
We wanted that perfect language.
Right. And his whole focus on having a one-to-one correspondence between sense and reference, between the meaning of a word and the thing it refers to, that was very much a reaction against the ambiguities of natural language.
He wanted to get rid of all that messiness.
Exactly.
So we've seen how ambiguity has been a topic of philosophical debate for ages, but the entry also gets into this really fundamental question. What exactly is it that's being ambiguous?
Right, it's a good question.
Is it the spoken word, the written sentence? The whole conversation, where does the ambiguity actually reside? It's about the vehicles of meaning, not the meaning itself.
What do you mean by that?
Well, propositions, the abstract meanings we're trying to express, those are generally considered unambiguous. It's the things we use to express them that can be ambiguous.
Yeah.
So An utterance, a sentence, even a whole discourse can be ambiguous.
I see.
Like, take a written sentence. If I just show you the words on paper, it might be ambiguous. But then if I speak that sentence out loud with a certain intonation or emphasis, that might actually resolve the ambiguity.
So the way we say something can change its meaning.
Exactly. And the entry also points out that you can have ambiguity in how words sound versus how they're spelled.
Right, like holy and holy, they sound the same but are spelled differently.
And then there's the opposite, words that are spelled the same but pronounced differently, like refuse, which can be a verb or a noun depending on how you say it.
You might not even realize the ambiguity is there until you hear it spoken.
Precisely. And then when we get into lexical ambiguity, where a single word has multiple meanings, it raises an interesting question for philosophers of language.
And what's that?
How do we represent that ambiguity? Like, take the word bank. It can refer to a financial institution or to the edge of a river.
Right, two very different meanings.
So do we say bank has one meaning with two very different aspects, or do we treat them as two completely separate words that just happen to look and sound the same?
That's a good question.
The entry leans towards the latter, treating them as separate lexical items. They point out that trying to represent them as a single meaning with a disjunction or just using subscripts doesn't really solve the underlying issue of their distinctness.
It's like sweeping the problem under the rug.
Kind of. And this all ties into the whole concept of polysemy, where a word has multiple related meanings.
Oh, right, like the word in. We can be in a car, in trouble, in love.
Exactly. So the question becomes, is polysemy just a type of ambiguity, or is it something different?
It's a bit of a gray area, isn't it?
It can be. The entry kind of hedges its bets. They say polysemy is essentially ambiguity, where the multiple meanings are meaningfully connected in some way.
So they're related, but still distinct.
Right. But other linguists, especially cognitive linguists, might argue that there's no clear dividing line between ambiguity and polysemy.
It's a spectrum?
Maybe. Possibly. And a word could even be both ambiguous and polysemous.
How so?
Well, it could have several related meanings that fall under polysemy, but then also have one or two completely unrelated meanings, which would be ambiguity.
Okay, so it can get quite complex.
It definitely can.
So we've established what ambiguity is, at least in a general sense, and why it's such a big deal for philosophers.
Right.
Now, the entry spends a good chunk of time talking about what ambiguity isn't. And it seems like that's just as important for really understanding it.
Oh, absolutely. It's by contrasting ambiguity with these related phenomena that we can really sharpen our understanding.
So let's dive into those contrasts. The first one they bring up is vagueness.
Okay, vagueness.
Now, we often use ambiguous and vague interchangeably, but they're actually quite different.
Right.
Like the word bat is ambiguous because it can refer to the animal or the piece of sporting equipment.
Two completely different things.
Exactly. But the word bald is vague. There's no clear dividing line between who is bald and who isn't.
It's a matter of degree.
Right. So vagueness is about a lack of precision, those fuzzy boundaries.
Yeah.
You can have this gradual transition from clearly having hair to clearly being bald.
With lots of borderline cases in between.
Yeah, where it's hard to say for sure, but with ambiguity, it's more like a switch between distinct meanings.
You're either talking about one thing or the other.
Now, I know you could probably come up with some bizarre hypothetical scenario where bat becomes vague.
Oh, I'm sure it could.
Like maybe a baseball bat slowly morphing into a real bat.
Right, that would make it vague in that particular instance.
But the point is that the ambiguity itself isn't inherently about borderline cases or those sore ice paradoxes that philosophers love to talk about.
Right. Although the entry does mention that some philosophers actually try to connect vagueness to something like ambiguity.
Interesting. How so?
Well, they suggest that vague terms might actually express multiple imprecise propositions or maybe even multiple semantic values.
So it's almost like they're saying vagueness is a kind of hidden ambiguity.
In a way, yeah.
That's pretty mind-bending. Okay, what about context sensitivity? How does that differ from ambiguity?
Well, context sensitivity is all about how the meaning or reference of a word can change depending on who's speaking, where they are, and so on.
Oh, right, like the words I, here, and now.
Exactly. If I say, I'm hungry, it means something different than if you say it.
Because I refers to a different person each time.
Right. But a word like bank, it doesn't change its core meanings based on who's saying it.
Okay.
Now, context can definitely help us figure out which meaning of bank is intended in a particular situation.
Like, if we're talking about money, we know it's the financial institution.
Exactly. But the ambiguity itself, the fact that bank has those two meanings, that's a property of the word itself, not its sensitivity to context.
So I has a single meaning, but it picks out different things depending on who's speaking. Bank has multiple meanings, and context helps us choose the right one.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, I'm starting to see the distinction. What about underspecification or generality? That one sounds tricky.
It can be. Let's say I have 3 sisters and I tell you I'm going to visit one of my sisters. That statement is underspecified.
Because I don't know which sister you're visiting.
Right. But the phrase one of my sisters itself isn't ambiguous.
It has a clear meaning, it just leaves some details out.
Exactly. It's sense general. It covers a range of possibilities without having multiple distinct meanings.
Okay.
Same thing with the word aunt. It could be your mother's sister or your father's sister, but the word aunt itself isn't ambiguous.
It has a single definition that covers both cases.
Right. The entry points out that it's easy to confuse sense generality with ambiguity, especially when a term's extension, the set of things it refers to, can be divided into clear categories.
Okay, I see what you mean. Like if I say, I ordered filet mignon, I'm not specifying whether it's cooked or raw.
Right.
But that doesn't mean filet mignon is ambiguous between those states.
No, it's just a general term for a cut of meat.
If I'm annoyed because it came out raw when I expected it cooked, that's about my expectations, not a misunderstanding of the term itself.
Exactly. And then there's sense and reference transfer, where we use a term to refer to something that's related to its literal meaning, but not exactly the same thing.
Oh, right, like saying I'm parked on G Street when you really mean your car is parked there.
Exactly. That's not really considered ambiguity, even though it involves a kind of shift in meaning.
So it sounds like a single sentence can have all sorts of things going on at once, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It can be a real linguistic stew.
You can be vague, context sensitive, ambiguous, and involve reference transfer all at the same time.
The entry gives a great example. My uncle wonders if I am parked where the bank begins.
Okay, let's break that down.
Well, first, it's sense general about which uncle we're talking about.
Right. You might have several uncles.
Then there's the ambiguity of bank.
Financial institution or riverbank.
Exactly. And we have context sensitivity with I and my because those depend on who's speaking.
Of course.
And where the bank begins could be vague because it's not clear exactly where that boundary is.
But finally, there's reference transfer because you're really talking about your car being parked, not yourself.
That's right. So you see, even a simple sentence can have all these different layers of complexity.
It's amazing how much is going on under the surface of language.
It really is.
Okay, so we've covered what ambiguity isn't. Now let's get into the different types of ambiguity, because that's where things get really interesting for philosophers.
I agree.
The entry breaks it down into a few main categories. First up is lexical ambiguity, which is probably the most straightforward type. Well, it just means that a single word has multiple meanings.
Right, like duck.
Oh.
It can be the bird or the action of lowering your head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or bat, the animal or the sporting equipment. Or cover, which can be a noun or a verb.
Run is another good one.
Oh, yeah, lots of meanings for run.
And even whole phrases can be lexically ambiguous, like kick the bucket.
Right, that can have its literal meaning, or it can be an idiom for dying.
Exactly.
And the entry points out that lexical ambiguity is usually pretty easy to spot when the meanings are totally different, like bat and bat.
Yeah, but it gets trickier when the meanings are more closely related.
Oh, right, like that little word in.
Mm.
It can mean so many things, but they're all kind of related to containment or location.
Right, so is in the car, in my thoughts, in trouble, truly ambiguous? Or does it have a single, very general meaning that gets specified by the context?
That's a tough question.
It is, and it often depends on your theoretical framework.
So different theories of language might give different answers.
Exactly. And then there's the word any, which has been a source of much debate among philosophers and linguists.
Oh, how so?
Well, it can act as a universal quantifier, like any student can solve this problem.
Meaning all students.
Right. But it can also have this free choice, meaning like you can pick any card.
Meaning I have a choice.
Exactly. So is that a genuine ambiguity, or are those just two slightly different uses of the same word?
Another tough one.
It is. And then on a more practical level, there's the question of how we represent lexical ambiguity in dictionaries and lexicons.
Oh, right. How do you actually list those multiple meanings?
Exactly. The entry favors treating them as separate entries. So you'd have one entry for bank as a financial institution and a separate entry for bank as a riverbank.
That makes sense.
It's clearer that way because even if you try to combine them into a single entry with a disjunction, it doesn't really capture the fact that those meanings are distinct.
Okay, so lexical ambiguity, it's all about words with multiple meanings. Now, the next type is syntactic ambiguity, and this was a bit more complex.
It is. This is where the structure of the sentence itself leads to multiple interpretations.
Oh, I see. So it's not about the individual words, but about how they're put together.
Exactly. And this can happen at different levels.
Okay.
Like sometimes it's about how phrases are grouped together, like in superfluous hair remover.
I love that example.
Right. It can mean a hair remover that's superfluous, or it can mean a remover of superfluous hair.
Two completely different things.
And it all depends on how you group the words together in your mind.
So the same words in a different order would have a different meaning.
Not necessarily a different order, but a different grouping. Like, is superfluous modifying hair remover as a unit, or is it modifying just hair?
Oh, I see. It's about which words are acting on which other words.
Exactly. And this kind of grouping is what linguists represent with those tree diagrams, to show the hierarchical structure of a sentence.
Yeah, those can get pretty complicated.
They can, but they're a useful way to visualize how syntax works. And sometimes syntactic ambiguity can also involve the different roles a phrase can play in a sentence.
Like how?
Well, take the sentence, John floated the boat between the rocks.
Okay.
Now, the phrase between the rocks, is that telling us where John floated the boat, or is it describing the boat's final location?
Oh, I see. So in one interpretation, between the rocks is just giving us additional information about the action of floating.
Right, it's an adjunct.
But in the other interpretation, it's actually specifying the destination of the boat.
Exactly, it's an argument of the verb float.
And that gives us a different syntactic structure and therefore a different meaning for the whole sentence.
Precisely. And then there's thematic ambiguity, where the same phrase seems to be playing different roles depending on the interpretation.
The entry gives the example, the chicken is ready to eat.
Right. That can mean the chicken is ready to be eaten, or it can mean the chicken is ready to eat something.
It all depends on whether we see the chicken as the agent or the patient of the action.
Exactly. And again, that leads to different syntactic structures and different meanings.
Okay, so we've got grouping ambiguity, role ambiguity, and thematic ambiguity.
And then there's ambiguity that comes from multiple connectives like and or.
Oh, right, like that example, he got drunk and fired or divorced.
Exactly. It's not clear whether the and or the or takes precedence.
It's like we need parentheses to disambiguate it.
Right, but natural language doesn't come with those handy little punctuation marks.
So it's up to us to figure out the intended meaning.
And sometimes the semantics of modal verbs, words like ought, might, and must, can also introduce ambiguity.
Oh, I see. Like, John ought to be home by now.
Right. That could be a prediction based on what we know about John's habits, or it could be a moral obligation.
Two very different meanings.
And the coin might come up heads, can be about metaphysical possibility, like it's physically possible for the coin to land on heads. Or it could just be about epistemic possibility, meaning we don't know for sure whether it will land on heads.
So might is expressing different kinds of possibility there.
Exactly. And there's a whole debate about whether those different flavors of modals represent true ambiguity or whether it's just a single meaning that gets specified by context.
Oh, right. That context sensitivity we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
And then we get into the real meat of things, at least for philosophers, with quantifier and operator scope ambiguity.
That's where things get really fun.
The classic example is every woman squeezed a man.
Ah, yes, a classic. That one can mean that each woman squeezed a different man.
Right.
Or it can mean that there's one very lucky or unlucky man who is squeezed by every woman.
And it all comes down to the order in which those quantifiers, every and a, take scope over the rest of the sentence.
Exactly. It's like those nested parentheses you mentioned earlier.
The order of operations matters.
Precisely. And these scope ambiguities can be really subtle. And sometimes one reading is so unlikely that we don't even notice it.
Like, someone is in a car accident every 10 seconds.
Right. Technically, that could mean there's one person who's constantly getting into car accidents.
Poor guy.
But we all interpret it to mean that different people are getting into accidents at different times.
Because the other interpretation is just too bizarre.
Exactly. But even though we might not always notice them, These scope ambiguities are really important for understanding the logic of language.
Because they can affect the validity of arguments.
Right. Remember that bachelor example from earlier? The fallacy there hinges on a scope ambiguity with the modal operator necessarily.
So if we misinterpret the scope, we can end up with a false conclusion.
Exactly. And there's even a debate about whether we should treat scope ambiguity as a genuine ambiguity at the level of logical form, or whether it's something that's resolved by pragmatic considerations.
So maybe it's not that the sentence itself has two meanings, but that we use our knowledge of the world to figure out the most likely interpretation.
That's the idea behind the pragmatic account.
Interesting. And then there's pronoun ambiguity, right? With those little words like he and she and it.
Right. Pronouns can be tricky, especially when it comes to bound versus unbound readings.
Like in everyone loves his mother.
Exactly. His could refer back to everyone, meaning each person loves their own mother.
No.
Or it could refer to some other male individual we've already been talking about.
Right. Like if we were talking about John earlier and then we said everyone loves his mother, can mean everyone loves John's mother.
Exactly. And this distinction between bound and unbound readings can be crucial for understanding the meaning of a sentence, especially in longer stretches of discourse.
So it's not just about single sentences. It's about how sentences connect to each other.
Right. And there are theories, like binding theory, that try to give us rules for when bound readings are possible. But even those rules don't always eliminate the ambiguity.
So sometimes it's still up to us to figure out what the pronoun refers to.
And again, there's debate about whether this ambiguity is fundamentally semantic, syntactic, or even pragmatic.
So many layers.
I know, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Okay, so we've got lexical ambiguity and syntactic ambiguity. Those seem like the main types.
The entry also talks about pragmatic ambiguity, which is a bit different.
Oh, right. Pragmatics is all about how we use language in context, right?
Exactly. So pragmatic ambiguity is less about the words themselves and more about how we intend them to be understood in a particular situation.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, take the sentence, the cops are coming.
Okay.
Now, depending on the context and the speaker's tone of voice, that could be a warning, an assertion, or even an expression of relief.